Welcome to Town Hall, everybody. My name's Anna Reynolds, I'm the Lord Mayor of Hobart, and I think we are trying to get a few more chairs, but in the meantime, Bill is keen for us to get started, just so we can stay on time. So once again, welcome to Town Hall for this very important event on this very important day. This is the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and it is a day to recognise the 370 million Indigenous people in the world who represent and protect more than 5,000 living cultures. Now, I would like to start by inviting Deborah Hocking to give us a welcome to country, and in line with Reconciliation Tasmania practice, I'd like to invite everyone to stand for the welcome to country. Thank you, Deborah.
Certainly is a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to Reconciliation Tasmania for inviting me, and acknowledge Auntie Patsy, Tim, and other Aboriginal elders, community members, and everybody. I'd like to welcome you today in my language, which I stand very proud being able to do that today. Ya, Palingla, Mina Deborah, Palawa Tankanuma Nopa, Mohenina, Mina Patbella, Tagarilia, Mohenina, Fanny Cochran Smith. Yamina, Palingida, Nina, Mapali, Malathina, Mana. Hello, it's good to see you. I am Deborah. The Aboriginal people that roamed this land were the Mohenina people. My ancestors come from the Mohenina people and Fanny Cochran Smith. I would like to welcome you all to my country today. Thank you. And can I just say at the end before, in talking about the treaty, I teach the children about the 1833 treaty, which has never really been honoured. And that's firmly in my mind today. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And be seated. Thanks, everybody. I'm very proud that the City of Hobart is hosting this Reconciliation Council of Tasmania event, which I hope will play a significant part of truth-telling. And truth-telling is a very important part of the reconciliation process. I would like to acknowledge Aboriginal elders present here today. I would also like to acknowledge leaders from all three political parties. The Honourable Jackie Petrusner, MP, who is representing Premier Hodgman, who is interstate on COAD duties and who has sent his personal apology. The Honourable Rebecca White, MP, Leader of the Opposition, and Ms Cassie O'Connor, Leader of the Tasmanian Greens, MP as well. There are also a number of other dignitaries, too many here to mention, but thank you all for coming and for your interest. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Patsy Cameron. Dr. Cameron is a direct descendant of Mana Lagena and an elder of the Heart of Country clan based in the northeast of Tasmania. She is co-chair of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Communities Alliance and a board member of Reconciliation Tasmania. Welcome, Patsy.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Deb, for that absolutely beautiful welcome to country. Through my mother's line, I trace my heritage to two great warrior leaders of colonial times, Mana Lagena of the North East Coastal Plains Nation and Tongalongta of the East Coast Oyster Bay Nation. Mana Lagena, Tongalongta, Multihilagena and Peliata are at the heart of this historical overview to explain the circumstances of a colonial treaty made in Van Diemen's Land in 1831. I honour these 4 resistance fighters and I acknowledge their bravery for defending their lands and ancient cultural traditions. I also acknowledge their courageous decisions they made to negotiate peace with the Van Diemen's Land government in 1831. Truth-telling and listening to the voices of our ancestors are pivotal to this presentation that seeks to acknowledge one of the most significant episodes of history, albeit 188 years ago, after a verbal treaty was sanctioned. The purpose is to highlight the promises made during colonial times to enable all Tasmanians to gain an understanding of profound historic injustices that remain unresolved. I believe we can move forward together we can't move forward together without knowing and understanding why a chapter of our history continues to cast a shadow over our island state while it remains unfinished business between successive governments and Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples. The Aboriginal population at the time of the British invasion in 1803 is unknown because no one bothered to count them as cultured beings. There are, however, speculative figures proposed for the original population. There's Henry Melville, who estimated 20,000, Clive Lloyd estimated 12,000, and James Calder between 6,000 and 8,000. There are other figures that range from 1,000 to 660. What we do know is when the Flinders Island Aboriginal establishment was abandoned in 1847, several hundred of our ancestors remained far from their homelands in the Wyberlin burial ground, and only 47 survived. 15 men, 22 women, 5 boys and 5 girls. They were transferred to a condemned penal settlement at Oyster Cove, south of Hobart. This was the result of acts of war that continued unabated throughout the late 1820s, when lethal conflicts between the colonists and the Aboriginal clans intensified. Clive Lord, a former director of TMAG, was told that in 1826 alone, 2,000 Aborigines were killed on the land frontier. This figure, of course, is substantiated, of course, because Lord remained, but Lloyd remained convinced that his source was authentic. And there were others that were concerned about the impacts of the frontier conflict, that those impacts were having on Aboriginal people. In December 1827, William Walk of Breadalbin wrote to Lieutenant Governor Arthur's office with a suggestion that a treaty might be negotiated with Aborigines of Van Diemen's Land, but it was disregarded at that time. The following year, martial law was declared, the outcome of which provided a legal catalyst for the colony to commit systematic acts of genocide against its own people. Under martial law, Aboriginal people could be shot at sight. To appease the colonists who were calling for total extermination of the savages, Lieutenant Governor Arthur proclaimed 2 campaigns to be undertaken simultaneously. The first was a military operation that would commence in October 1830 with several thousand soldiers and colonists deployed to drive Aborigines trapped ahead of the advancing lines into the Tasman Peninsula, where they would be captured. Alongside this military operation, armed bounty hunters, referred to often as roving parties, were sent out to surrounding bushland to hunt Aborigines. Both operations dispersed Aboriginal people away from their homelands, and they were forced to seek safe haven in remote neighbouring lands. A second campaign was Arthur's commission of George Augustus Robinson and his group of Aboriginal guides, who were to circumambulate the island and negotiate with clans still free in the bush to place themselves under his protection. Robinson's treks between 1829 and 1835 were recorded as befriending missions. My ancestral grandfather, Manalagina, was among the small confederated group located by Robinson inland from the Bay of Fires on the 1st of November 1830. Through his Aboriginal guides, Robinson communicated his purpose to the group. He explained the military line operation that was underway to the south by drawing many lines on the ground. His insistence must have startled the people, for when a loud noise was heard in the distance, he amplified their fears by agreeing with them that it must be musket fire. He claimed that the soldiers were coming to shoot them, even though he knew that military operation was moving southward. A group of 5 men, including grandfather Manalagina and 2 women, 5 men and 2 women, agreed to place themselves under Robinson's protection. They were the first to leave their homelands to go into exile. This was November 1830, 9 months before a treaty was made. But the idea of a treaty with Aboriginal nations was being considered by some officials at that time. In February 1831, Chief Justice John Roos Pedder, in a speech to the Executive Council, presented treaty as an alternative to the Aborigines being banished from their homelands. However, by this time, Robinson had already established Swan Island as a place for his growing number of exiles, and treaty wasn't on his mind. In early 1831, the Aborigines were relocated further away from the mainland to Gun Carriage Island in Franklin Sounds off Flinders Island. Manalagina and his young wife Tanglabonia were allocated one of 9 cottages on the island. But despair soon replaced hope when several deaths were recorded within a few weeks of their arrival. Meanwhile, Robinson returned to the northeast coast to search for another group in the bush. This group of 6 men and 1 woman was led by cunning leader, Multi-Lagina, who was known as Umara. Robinson spent several months of frustration following trails that went cold, and finally he sent a boat to Gun Carriage with orders to take Manalagina to assist Robinson to make physical contact with this other group led by Multi-Lagina. Robinson greeted Manalagina as he stepped ashore at Little Muswaro Bay, and the content of this meeting was recorded in his journal on the 6th of August 1831. This morning I developed my plans to the Chief Manalagina and explained to him the benevolent views of the government towards himself and people. He cordially acquiesced and expressed his entire approbation of the salutary measure and promised his utmost aid and assistance. I informed him, in the presence of Pictopola, that I was commissioned by the Governor to inform them that if the natives would desist of their wanton outrages upon the whites, they would be allowed to remain in their respective districts and would have flour, tea and sugar, clothes, etc. given them. That a good white man would dwell with them, who would take care of them and would not allow any bad white man to shoot them. And he would go about the bush like myself, and they could hunt. He was much delighted. Robinson's account emphatically records the details of this promise made at Little Muswaro Bay on the 6th of August 1831, the terms of which were agreed by both parties. Robinson was Lieutenant Governor Arthur's representative, and Manalagina was the great leader. The promise was witnessed by Pictopola, who was known to Arthur and could also speak English well. Robinson reiterated the terms of this agreement on the 27th of August 1831 when he wrote, "I omit no opportunity of expressing upon the mind of the chief and others that they are to remain in their own country, and that I am anxious to get them for the purpose of going to others, and that I will leave a man to take care of them, and that some of the Tiralaw women will stay with them, At this arrangement, they were much pleased and say it is very good indeed. When Manilagena successfully made contact with Montehiligena and brought his group to meet Robinson at Little Muswaro River on the 29th of August 1831, he relayed the views of the government, stating, "I made known to them the wish of the government that if they would not spear white men, they might remain and hunt, and they seemed glad and lifted up their hands and said, no, no, no." Robinson moved out of the northeast to search for other small groups in the bush. All the while, he continued to induce his guides, now including Manilagena, by reinforcing the agreements made at the Little Muswaro Bay and Little Pipers River. He said, "I omit no opportunity in impressing upon the mind of the chief and other natives that they are to remain in their own country, and repeating to them the benevolent intentions of the government towards the native tribes." Robinson made sure that they would not abscond. He threatened a warrior from Port Sorell, Ninganupana, that if he went away, the soldiers would shoot him. On the 31st of December 1831, after travelling through the rugged country on the Central Plateau, Robinson met up with a group of 16 men, 9 women and a child near Lake Echo. They included 2 powerful, formidable warriors, Tongalongta of Oyster Bay and Montpeliata of the Big River Nation. This group of 26 were believed to be all that remained of 2 great nations that once numbered over 1,000. Robinson recorded the following: "They were willing to accept the offers of the government and placed themselves under my protection accordingly." He added, in a note to the Colonial Secretary, "These people cannot and ought not be looked upon as captives. They have placed themselves under my protection and are desirous of peace." Tongalongta and Montpeliata, 2 powerful warriors, had agreed to a truce. Robinson and his Aboriginal guides and the Big River and Oyster Bay people, numbering 26, arrived in Hobart Town on the 7th of January 1832. They were holding spears in their hands and accompanied by 100 dogs. The warriors, women and the child walked to Government House and met the governor. John Glover's sketch depicts the group waiting for a boat to transport them to Wailena. Montpeliata can be seen sitting with the group at the top, his second from the right. They would never touch their homelands again. Montehiligena died in Launceston in mid-1832. Montpeliata, renamed Waterloo by Robinson, died at Wailena in mid-1835. Manilagena died at Wailena on December 4th, 1835. And Tongalongta, renamed King William by Robinson, died at Wailena in June 1837. According to Lyndall Ryan, death and despair at Wailena was, quote, "the price of surviving the wars with the settlers by incarceration in a place far from their homeland," end quote. The people of Wailena waited for news of their return to their respective homelands. They did not forget the promises made by Robinson in the bush. In 1834, the Commandant of Wailena, Henry Nichols, wrote, "The basic problem is quite clear. The Aborigines have been induced to leave their native land by a promise that all their wants would be supplied, and they expected this undertaking to be honoured. They were eager to learn to write, not to become scholars like white men, but to be able to write to their governor father in Hobart, as they are anxious to induce him to remove them to their native land. They would be perfectly wretched were they certain they should die there. As time passed, they refused to work for their rations, and they refused to grow crops. They said, the king will keep them, white men work, not them. According to Little Ryan, they considered their rations as bare compensation for the loss of their land. They despised the Commandant, Dr. Jarrett, for inflicting spiteful and inhumane punishment against them. And when rumours circulated in 1846 that Jarrett was returning as Commandant, the people took action, first by complaining to the Governor, and in February 1846, they petitioned Queen Victoria. This petition of 1846 stated, the humble petition of the free Aborigines, inhabitants of Van Diemen's Land, who live upon Flinders Island in Bass's Strait, most humbly showeth that we, your Majesty's petitioners, are your free children, that we were not taken prisoners, but freely gave up our country to Colonel Arthur, then the Governor, after defending ourselves. Your petitioners humbly state to your Majesty that Mr. Robinson made for us, and with Colonel Arthur, an agreement which we have not lost from our minds since, and we have made our part of it good. When we left our place, we were plenty of people, and we now but a little one. This petition to Queen Victoria made absolutely clear that the people had not forgotten those arrangements made by Arthur and Lieutenant Governor and Robinson 15 years earlier, and that they had kept their part of the agreement, and it fortified their determination that those promises made should be honoured. The petition was signed by 8 men: Walter George Arthur, King Alexander, David Bruni, John Allen, Washington, Frederick, King Tippu, and Augustus. The Crown responded, but not as the people expected. A year later, Waibelina was abandoned, and rather than returning to their homelands as promised, the surviving 47 people were relocated to the condemned penal settlement at Oyster Cove, south of Hobart, a place that was not good enough for the convicts. When Robinson's task was completed on the mainland in late 1835, he took up his new position as Commandant of Waibelina. By this time, my grandfather Managena realised that the little Musselburgh Bay promise would never be honoured. He knew that he was tricked into leaving his homelands. He knew he would never hunt or walk in the footprints of his ancestors, or see his country again. When he arrived at Green Island, off Flinders, he cut off his ochred hair and his beard. These were symbols of a warrior status, symbols of a revered leader. And Manawagena died within a month of his return into exile. Okay, I can never get through that. This is our history. This is your history. This is Tasmania's history. We can lament, but we cannot change the past. But our lives are intrinsically linked to the past as it shapes the future. Treaty is an important part of Tasmania's unfinished business and as a moral imperative. I call on our Tasmanian government and all the members of the Tasmanian Parliament to take steps to formally acknowledge the existence of the Van Diemen's Land Treaty of 1831 in all of its entirety. those promises made to those four great leaders have to be honoured. Both houses of Parliament should unanimously resolve this business and clear the way to support a treaty dialogue with us, the living descendants of those warriors who agreed to the original treaty. I am aware of present discussions that are happening about Tasmanian treaty, and I know Michael has been leading those discussions. But there are probably many views to be heard. Therefore, my advice is for all Tasmanian Aboriginal people to explore what a treaty means to them and discuss what treaty might look like in the 21st century. I also encourage all Tasmanians to walk beside us on our journey. Only then can we walk together as proud Tasmanians who had the courage and the compassion to reconcile the past in the present day. Thank you.
Patsy. It was a very powerful reminder of our history, and it is a history that demands attention. It's a history that Tasmania will have to respond to. I'd now like to call on Tim McCormack, who is the Dean of the Law Faculty of UTAS and has had a very illustrious legal career in Tasmania and nationally and internationally. And Tim is going to provide some further information and responses to Dr. Cameron's speech. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thank you, Deb, for your welcome to country, and thank you, Patsy. It's a great honour for me to share the stage with Auntie Patsy. She's represented our Indigenous community, our Aboriginal community, so magnificently, and spoken some incredible truths to us today. Truths that haven't necessarily been hidden. There are people in the room, Henry Reynolds and others, who've written about these same truths. But she has laid down a challenge to us as white Tasmanians, and I'm honoured to be able to stand with her and to respond in part as I'm about to do. I suspect that if it could just be up to Patsy and I, we'd sort it out in no time. Of course, that's not how it works, and neither she nor I are in a position to be able to say what a treaty should contain or what supplementary clauses should be included in the 1831 treaty we were to revisit it in consultation with our Indigenous people. But for me, it is an opportunity to say some things about what a treaty is and why it's important and why this nation and our state is lagging behind so many other places, so many other countries that have negotiated treaties with their own First Peoples. We know from today, if we didn't already know it, that Lieutenant Governor Arthur, through George Augustus Robinson, made a promise to Manalagena and Tongalongaveta and others, and that promise was broken and has never been honoured. In my view, societies that fail to come to grips with violent pasts that include unresolved and egregious injustice will never flourish to their full potential. Denial, indifference, and societal blindness create a dead weight that persists indefinitely in the absence of change. It's important today not to underestimate the significance in Tasmania of the Aboriginal Lands Act of 1995, which ceded control over a number of islands and sites of importance around the state to the Tasmanian Aboriginal Lands Council. And nor is it important to overlook Premier Hodgman's 2015 Reset the Relationship speech, which led to the amendment of the Tasmanian State Constitution to recognise our Aboriginal communities as the first peoples of Tasmania. But there is still important work to do despite those significant breakthroughs of the not-so-distant past. It's easy for us, perhaps as lawyers or as citizens of this country, to assume that Robinson's promise has no contemporary legal effect. And yet there is a profoundly important decision of the Supreme Court of Canada from 1990 that suggests completely the opposite. You put up the next slide, please. I'm grateful to Henry Reynolds for pointing out this case to me, the case of the Crown against Suey, a decision of the full court of the Canadian Supreme Court in 1990. This was a judgment handed down unanimously in a single judgment, as emphatic a statement as it can be on the law of Canada. We are so used to, in the High Court of Australia, dissenting judgments or separate opinions, where even if one judge agrees with the majority, still believes that it's important to articulate a slightly different reasoning to reach the same result. A single judgment issued by all 9 justices is as emphatic a statement of the law as is possible. In this case, the justices of the Canadian Supreme Court were reviewing the legal effect of a treaty from 1760 negotiated between the British and the local Huron Indian tribe in a particular part of Quebec. In 1990, the Canadian justices said that 1760 treaty, despite the passage of 230 years, is still legally valid and binding upon the authorities of Quebec and the rest of Canada. And I think that's a very important decision. A treaty with First Peoples, the justices said, must be given a just, a broad, and a liberal construction. Very interesting to read through the judgment, as I did, having been tipped off by Henry of its existence, and to see what they meant by that. When the British negotiated a treaty with the Huron tribe, the Huron weren't necessarily literate. They didn't understand binding legal agreements that the British were so familiar with. So it's our responsibility as the ultimate decision maker of the law of Canada to be able to interpret the terms of what were agreed just, broadly, and with liberal construction. And any uncertainties in how we interpret and apply the terms of the treaty must be resolved in favour of the Indians, the Indigenous people. These justices held that there were 3 key characteristics of an effective and binding treaty: the intention to create legal obligations, the presence of mutually binding obligations between the parties to the treaty, and a certain measure of solemnity. Now, those of you who know contract law will understand that these 3 characteristics are more relaxed than the requirements for a binding legal contract. And the justices of the Canadian Supreme Court were at some lengths to explain why that was the case. Think about those 3 characteristics, and apply them to the circumstances that Auntie Patsy talked about, the agreement between Robinson and the Aboriginal elders with whom he negotiated. All 3 of those characteristics were undoubtedly present. These guys walked down Elizabeth Street and went out to meet the governor because of their sense of injustice and denial and deceit that the promise that had been made was not being fulfilled. They petitioned Queen Victoria 15 years after the agreement had been made to say we're still waiting for it to be honoured. There's no question that in their minds there was an intention to create obligations. There were mutually binding obligations. You stop killing white settlers, lay down your spears, and you'll be able to return to your traditional homeland, and a certain measure of solemnity. Now, I'm not trying to suggest, I couldn't, as Dean of the Law School at the University of Tasmania, that if that 1831 agreement was presented to the Supreme Court, as Dean of the Law School, I couldn't say the Supreme Court justices would say it creates binding obligations and interpret it the same way the Canadian Supreme Court did in their particular case. But a decision like this in a fellow Commonwealth country would be given great weight in Australian courts. And it's not possible to easily dismiss the continuing legal significance of what happened in 1831 despite the passage of 188 years. So I ask myself some questions. Why is a treaty within First Peoples, with, in our case, our Aboriginal community, important? It's important because it's an acknowledgement of the legal status of the other party. That's what's inherent in the concept, the legal concept of a treaty. We are negotiating on equal terms. In negotiating treaties with Indigenous or First Peoples, the respective government is acknowledging the pre-existing, in our case the pre-colonial sovereignty of First Peoples over their lands, and that colonial conquest and subsequent subjugation did not extinguish the rights of our First Peoples. Michael Mansell, in his book Treaty and Self-Determination, says that invasion and occupation may result in temporary deprivation of a people to exercise and enjoy their rights. But invasion and occupation do not and cannot extinguish the rights of the local population. If that was the case, then Iraqis, Afghanis, Palestinians, and the list would go on and on and on around the world, would no longer enjoy legal rights to their land. That's not true. We, as a nation, are the only Western nation not to have negotiated a treaty or treaties with our First Peoples. The US, Canada, and New Zealand have all done so. And tellingly, as we think about, as we contemplate the importance of a treaty with our Aboriginal people, tellingly, when Lieutenant Governor Arthur returned to the UK and reported in 1836 and reported to the Colonial Office after the end of his term as governor here, he told them, and again I thank Henry for pointing this out to me, that it was a strategic mistake on the part of the colonial authorities not to have negotiated a treaty with the Aboriginal people of Van Diemen's Land, because that failure led to war with the settlers. And Henry believes, and I'm sure he's right, that that advice, that plea from Arthur, do not repeat this mistake in New Zealand, was one of the major catalysts for the negotiation of the Treaty of Waitangi. And those of you who know anything about New Zealand relations with the Māori people know how fundamentally important the Treaty of Waitangi is. There are some common fallacies about treaties with Indigenous people. It's often assumed wrongly that sovereignty within a nation is unitary and cannot be divided. Australia enters into treaties with other nations, with other sovereign nation states, and can't enter into a treaty that is internal to its own country. And I'm an international lawyer by expertise, and that's my predisposition to think about treaties in terms of sovereign nation states negotiating treaties. But this is a major fallacy. And if you just have the next slide, there are a couple of quotes from the United States. In the US, for example, Supreme Court Chief Justice Marshall, in the case of the Cherokee Nations against Georgia, a decision from 1831, had this to say about the Cherokee. The Cherokee Nation is a distinct community occupying its own territory with boundaries accurately described, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force, and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter but with the assent of the Cherokees themselves, or in conformity with treaties and with the acts of Congress. 1831 statement from the Chief Justice, the then Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court. Even President George W. Bush, hardly a paragon of liberalism, although perhaps all of a sudden seems more liberal than George Bush, as president, affirmed in 2001, "My administration will continue to work with tribal governments on a sovereign-to-sovereign basis." It's the United States. The President of the United States says this. "We will protect and honour tribal sovereignty and help to stimulate economic development in reservation communities." This same attitude that the sovereignty of the Indigenous people was not extinguished with colonial invasion, dispossession and subjugation, but that it must be recognised, acknowledged and affirmed as coexisting with the sovereignty of the state, as concurrent with, as shared, however you want to characterise it. This is the attitude in the United States, this is the attitude in Canada, and it's also the attitude in New Zealand. A second fallacy, a fallacious assumption, or perhaps even a pernicious assertion, is that recognising Aboriginal sovereignty in a treaty will result in successful land claims in my backyard, that I'll have to subdivide, or I'll be thrown out of the property that I and the bank own in freehold. That's not true. That is not true in the United States. It's not true in Canada, and it's not true in New Zealand, where hundreds or thousands in the case of the United States, treaties have been negotiated, sometimes between the federal government and the Indian nation, sometimes with the state governments of the Indian nations, on the basis of a notion of coexistence of sovereignty or of concurrent sovereignty. There are some important truths that we as a nation and we as a state must acknowledge. Just have the next over here. Senator Patrick Dodson describes Aboriginal sovereignty this way: "Our songlines, the ancient tracks of our ancestor spirit beings, created a sense of nation or oneness out of people who spoke different languages and occupied different landscapes." And for Callum Clayton Dixon, Aboriginal sovereignty derives from the ancient reciprocal relationship we have with our lands. This relationship finds its roots in our connection to kin and country, manifesting in our song, dance and story, our language, ceremony and law. It is vested in the individual, the tribe and the nation. Our sovereignty has endured since the first sunrise. It cannot be handed to us or taken from us. Aboriginal sovereignty can only be expressed or suppressed. The fact that Aboriginal communities did not organise themselves in the same way as civilised, and I put that word in quotation marks, Britain did not justify the claim of terra nullius, the basis on which the British Crown claimed sovereignty over the entire continent. Terra nullius, the Latin expression to describe a land empty of people, civilised people. We know that that was a fiction. Our High Court of Australia has told us so. Bruce Pascoe, in his stunning Dark Emu, has done an incredible job of exploding the myth of Aboriginal communities as opportunistic hunter-gatherers. If you haven't read Dark Emu yet, please do so. Just go to the next slide. I want to quote a passage from Justice Brennan's decision in the groundbreaking case that the High Court reached in 1992 in Mabo against Queensland. Brennan concluded that to treat the dispossession of the Australian Aboriginals as the working out of the Crown's acquisition of ownership of all land on first settlement is contrary to history. could have said it's bullshit, but judges the High Court don't say that. Aboriginals were dispossessed of their land parcel by parcel to make way for expanding colonial settlement. Their dispossession underwrote the development of the nation. Victoria, the Northern Territory and Queensland are all on the path to negotiation of a treaty or possibly multiple treaties with their respective Aboriginal communities. Next month in October, Victorian Aboriginal communities are to vote to elect the first People's Assembly, which will be the body to negotiate with the Victorian government the terms of a treaty in Victoria. Northern Territory has appointed Mick Dodson as the Commissioner to explore and to consult with Aboriginal communities of the Northern Territory about how best to move forward towards the negotiation of a treaty with the government of the Territory. And Queensland has just announced its initiation of a process and appointed their Treaty Commissioner and mandated that Commissioner to begin the process of consulting with Aboriginal communities in Queensland. In Western Australia, they've taken a slightly different approach. Rather than negotiate a treaty about sovereignty, there has been an incredible agreement, the Noongar Agreement, that covers vast tracts of southwest Western Australia, which constitutes a land use agreement between the Indigenous peoples of that part of Western Australia and the government. And that agreement covers a whole stack of residential towns and cities and demonstrates the fallacy that negotiating with Aboriginal people over land means the theft of my own backyard. What could happen in Tassie? What's possible here? As I said earlier on, neither Patsy nor I have any authority to attempt to describe the content of what a Tassie treaty should contain. That's not for us to do. And hopefully one consequence of today is that we might start a conversation about this topic. But I want you to imagine with me what could be possible here. And I thank Michael Henderson for this suggestion. Imagine if in this heart-shaped island that we all love to call home, our government, on behalf of non-Aboriginal Tasmania, reached out with a non-Indigenous statement from the heart, a kind of local response to the Uluru statement from the heart, but proactive and uniquely Tasmanian. And what if in that statement our government on our behalf acknowledged the wrongs of the past, including the deceit that led to the unfulfilled promise, to Manawageta and Tonawangata and the other leadership of that final remnant that was prepared to negotiate what they thought was a genuine peace. Imagine if this statement expressed our desire to negotiate a treaty or to revisit the 1831 treaty and supplement it with some additional content and offered to initiate a consultative process to identify who should represent our Aboriginal community in negotiations with the government. Imagine what goodwill such a statement could engender, and imagine what a game changer it might be for our state and our relationship with our Aboriginal community. Thanks so much, Patsy, for opening your heart to me and to all of us like me who don't share the heritage that you have, except vicariously, and that's a very special thing. I hope that as a state we could learn to truly embrace the depth of the culture, the language, the religion and the law of our First Peoples, our Aboriginal community. Thanks very much.
really been fortunate to be here today and to have such a rich amount of fascinating and important information provided to us by both Patsy and Tim. I'm just looking at Bill to understand whether we've got time for questions or comments. We do have some time, so that's wonderful. So if anyone would like to ask a question or to say a few words, please raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you. Just wait for the microphone, and if you wouldn't mind standing and just introducing yourself, please.
My name is Carol. Thank you, Kim. I have a question. I've heard it said that by default, all Crown lands belong to our Indigenous community, and I don't know what to make of that. Could you please explain?
Thanks, Carol. I'd say first of all that all land in the whole of the continent belong to our Aboriginal people. The issue about Crown land really arose in the Mabo decision, where the High Court granted to Eddie Mabo and the Meriam people who he represented the native title to the island of Mer, where the Meriam people lived. Henry Reynolds was living in Queensland at the time and did a lot of work on the historical background to the Meriam people's experience and enjoyment of their land and their freedom. He worked very closely with two wonderful barristers, Ron Caston and Brian Keon Cohen, who argued that case pro bono because of their commitment to attempt to try to challenge past injustices. The High Court said in the Mabo case that in relation to Crown land, not freehold land and not pastoral leasehold land, but for Crown land where Aboriginal communities had enjoyed uninterrupted rights of enjoyment over that land, they were entitled to native title. And subsequent to Mabo, the Native Title Tribunal has been set up, and native title claims around the country have been argued for and have been granted. But there was a very important subsequent decision of the High Court, which was the case of Wick, the Wick people, W-I-K. And in the Wick case, it was about whether or not native title survived a pastoral leasehold. So going beyond the issue of Crown land to pastoral leases. Henry was again involved in giving expert historical support to Ron Caston and Brian Keon Cohen. And what Henry was able to discover and what Brian and Ron were able to argue successfully was that pastoral leases that were granted back in the 1800s did not extinguish the rights of Indigenous people to enjoy access to the land. And as a consequence of that, they were able to successfully argue in Wick that in the case of pastoral leases which did not extinguish native title, Aboriginal people were still able to have access to the land, to perform ceremonies, to enjoy their connection to their country. These are profoundly significant historical decisions that really constituted game changers in the approach of Australian law to relations between white and Indigenous Australia. And I'm really proud to have counted Ron Caston and Brian Keon Cohen as dear friends because of their commitment to this cause. And proud of Henry's involvement to support them. Neither of them were historians, just outstanding advocates.
So I just want to take this opportunity, not to respond to your question, Carol, but for all of us to have a standing ovation for our wonderful Henry Reynolds, because Henry has contributed a lifetime of work to the history of not only Tasmania but Australia. Thank you so much, Henry, for all the effort that you put in, your compassion passion and your commitment, and especially when you were my supervisor when I did a master class.
That was just a proud daughter moment. Is there any other questions? Yes.
G'day, my name is Tom Alexander, and with full respect to the current colonial paradigm, I'd like to direct a question to Dr. Patsy about her ideas on a coherent conversation between traditional law from an Indigenous perspective and the current paradigm which we exist in.
Sorry, would you mind just repeating your question just a little bit?
Dr. Patsy, with full respect, I would love to ask for your opinion from an Indigenous perspective about the key ingredients involved in a coherent conversation between colonial law and traditional law of the people.
Thank you very much for your question. And this is at the heart of the difference between a moral imperative here and the legal imperative. Aboriginal people, when they made laws and they abided by those laws, if those laws were broken, they would get a spear, probably in their thigh first. Law was what bound us to our culture and our land and all of our beliefs. It was just absolutely part of our whole being. So when those laws were made, when those agreements were made in 1831, Mont Peliata and Tongalonta were powerful warriors, and if they truly believed they were going to be deceived, Robinson would have got a spear, and I don't know whether it would have been in his thigh or where, but it would have been, punishment would have been meted out. So it was pretty harsh, but at the same time, when they made a commitment, like they committed to a peace, to a truce, that was held for all those years. That's the difference between Aboriginal law to some degree and the law that the colonials were operating under.
I might just say a couple of things as well, Colin, if I could, in response. The British view was that a mark of its civilisation in the world was its legal institutions, processes and substance of the law. And when British settlers first arrived and established their colony, they genuinely believed that they were bringing their form of civilisation, which was the best in their view, to this God-forsaken place full of savages who many of them did not even consider fully human. And this, for me, is a sort of contrast between Aboriginal law and colonial law, because colonial law did not recognise the humanity of our Aboriginal people for decades. It was 1967 that we decided as a nation to recognise Aboriginal citizenship and confer upon our Aboriginal brothers and sisters full entitlement under the law. It's a long time between 1788 and 1967. And there was a law, a colonial law, that it was a crime to murder an Aboriginal person in Tasmania. And there were some who were in positions of authority who were proud of that law. But that law had very little, if any, effect once you extended out beyond the sort of area of Hobart that the colonial authorities exercised effective authority and control over. And tragically, many of the Aboriginal people killed in this place were killed by settlers and by police who never reported the deaths, and those deaths were never investigated. So the British colonial authorities took great pride in their institutions, but there was a huge gap between what the law actually said and its efficacy. Out in the areas where settlers were pushing further and further to take over yet more arable land. A legal system that says one thing and is incapable of implementation and enforcement is not the sort of legal system we want to have. And that, I think, is an indictment on the lack of effectiveness of colonial law, especially in the early decades of settlement here.
Thank you. Thank you for those two very comprehensive responses. Well, it is now just after 2 o'clock, and so that draws to an end our event for today. Billy, would you like to have another question, or no? We're going to draw it to a close now. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Please speak with your friends and family about what you've learned today. Please get involved with the Reconciliation Tasmania and their work. And it was a very a wonderful way to spend the International Day of Indigenous Peoples here in Hobart Town Hall. Can you once again put your hands together for our wonderful speakers?